this tutorial. Today we're going to have a look at the selection tools in Adobe Photoshop, and specifically those that are going to help us out in our digital matte painting. Now it's important to remember that the selection tool does exactly that. It selects an area, and that allows you to manipulate whatever is inside that selection, whether that's erasing it, cutting out, painting over it, and making adjustments. So Adobe has got some really basic stuff. It's got some advanced stuff. Most of your selection tools are actually in the very top tier of our toolbar over here on the left. So Move Tool obviously is one of our priority tools. Hopefully you should all be aware of the shortcut for that as V. Below that we have the rectangular and elliptical Marquee Selection tool, circles and squares, and then our Lasso tools. Also we've got Quick Selection and Magic Wand and fairly new Object Selection tool as well. So these are our primary selection tools. There are some other ones out there as well, including the pen tool, which is very precise, and we also have other selection options up here, including things like color range and also subject, which can be quite helpful as well. So let's jump straight into it. I've got this image of this very interesting looking object that I've taken a photo of. Not the greatest photo, it's behind glass, so a bit blurry and all the rest of it, but it's pretty good for showing you some of these tools. Now I will recommend that if you are struggling with your image, Photoshop does prefer a higher res image to deal with than a lower res, because don't forget we are dealing with pixels, and Photoshop needs to differentiate between pixels in order to get a good selection. So if you've got fewer pixels, it's going to struggle getting a precise selection. Alright, let's jump straight in. Marquee and elliptical tool, rectangles and circles. That's pretty much it. If you click and drag, you can create whatever rectangle shape you want, or you can switch over to the elliptical tool and create whatever circle shape you want. Now by pressing shift, it will lock your shape into a fixed aspect, so perfect circle or perfect square. So a couple of quick shortcuts to tools to remember. Deselect, super important. If you have an area selected and you still have a marquee or another selection tool, if I click outside of that, it will deselect the shape. So there's my circle, click outside, deselect. If I start creating a shape elsewhere, also it will deselect. Be very cautious with this. This will happen eventually. You may have an area selected and you'll go, I'm going to click outside to deselect, and what you may actually do is, instead of deselecting, you'll make a tiny selection, and this could be 1 pixel, and then you'll jump in and start trying to paint somewhere and nothing will happen, and it is something happening, but what you're doing is you can only manipulate what is in that selection. So if you get the idea of Command or Control D to deselect, it's also up here, select, deselect up here as well. So I'm going to just get my whole image into screen, Command or Control 0, and don't forget zoom in, zoom out, Control plus, Control minus, or bring up, go to Window and bring up your navigator if that's the thing that you like to use. Very handy, but most of the time I'll usually have that turned off. Cool. Now a couple other things, and this applies to just about all the selection tools as well. If you make a selection and you want to add to that selection, press shift. By pressing shift, you should see a little plus sign pop up on our cursor, and that will allow you to add to that selection. So I might start going around this and going, okay, you can move this around once you've created it. If you're still on that selection tool, you can move that around, and then you can press shift and create another one, but it's going to create a single selection area and it's going to move around as a single selection, so you can't just break it into different selections. So add a selection, press shift. To subtract, press alt, and you'll see that will become a negative, and you can start subtracting from that. Once we have that selected, if we want, we can change that to any other selection tool we want. We can add a rectangular tool, and I can shift add to that, or alt subtract. If I do not press shift or alt, it will start creating a new shape. So let's deselect out of there once again. Now unfortunately this is on an angle, and if I wanted to select an area of this, let's zoom in a little bit. Let's say I want to get the front face of this little adjustment. I can create a ellipse, and it's not going to quite fit. Just the perspective of this is not correct. Now there are things we can do to help this. What we can do is when this is selected, you can right click. This will bring up some secondary options. So this is our selection. We're clicking inside here, and I'm going to go down to transform selection. So I'm going to transform the actual selection. Now that I can transform the selection, I can scale and move it. Now you'll notice at the moment this is scaling proportionately. So if we look at the top bar here, we can see there is a chain link between the width and the height. So if I untick that, that means I can start stretching it. So just check yours. It might be on by default, it might not. Either way, I'm still not going to get a perfect result from this because I'm just changing the width or height. I could try rotating as well, but again, it all might be a bit of a loss because this is on an angle. What we can do now though, that we are transforming the selection, is I can right click again, and now we have options for our transformation. And the one I really recommend for this is distort. Perspective is more for sort of graphic design and stuff like that. Warp's going to do some funky stuff, so if you really do need to do some weird warping effects, then that could be handy. But most of the time, distort is going to hit most of the markers because this allows us to grab the individual corners and midpoints for this, and you can start shifting this around and trying to align that. So usually what I recommend, if it is a elliptical shape, if you aim for the ends to be the midpoints of that shape, and you can shuffle that in. Now this resolution is not great at this size, but as you can see, we can get pretty damn close to that. Once you've done that, we actually haven't made a selection here yet. We're actually still transforming the selection. So now we need to apply that. You can either hit enter or tick up here, or you can press escape or the little circle with a cross. I'm happy with that, so I'm going to hit the tick, and there it is there. Now if I want to get these ends ticking down here, then what I could do is grab my lasso tool and extend out there, but for now let's leave it as that. Once you've got it selected, you've got some options to make. If you just keep on your selection tool, you can move that around, but if you move to your actual move tool, V, you can see that that will actually cut that selection and you can move that around. Other options as well, you could do things like Command or Control J, and that will copy and paste in place. And there we go, there's my copy and paste, and you can see in the layer panel, there it is. A lot of people jump to Command or Control C and then V to copy and paste. While that will work in some situations, you will occasionally get a jump where it will move its location. So if you can remember Command or Control J, it's a really handy one. It saves you pressing an extra button as well. Copy and paste in place. While I'm on the subject, there's my copy and paste object. I've just turned off the visibility for that layer. There he is there. If I want to reselect that layer, and that layer consists purely of that little shape there, I don't need to worry about going with a lasso tool or another selection tool. All I need to do is go over to the layer panel onto the thumbnail here, press Command or Control, and you can see my hand has a little rectangle when I press that, and click in there, and they will automatically select whatever is in that layer. So if I select this background layer, I'm hitting Command or Control, that will select that entire layer. And a bit hard to see the marching ants on that one, but there it is there. That layer is now selected, and you also have the option up in the selection area here. But it's good to know the shortcuts. Instead of going to the drop down menu, just go to your layer panel and Command and Control select, and you can jump through and select whatever you need to for there. So that's how to use the rectangular and elliptical tool, and also how to transform the shape of that selection layer. So that's pretty exciting sort of stuff, knowing that we can actually manipulate the shape of an ellipse or rectangle just by going transform selection, then right clicking and going to distort, and pretty cool stuff. Next one we're going to have a look at, let's deselect out of there, is the lasso tools. There are 3 of these. There's typically one that I recommend for most situations, and it is the poly lasso tool. I'm going to go through these pretty quick, but let's zoom in to our object once again. Our freeform lasso tool is literally that. As you drag your shape, that is what you will get. As soon as you let go of your left mouse button, it will close the shape off. So you really have to do this in one big sweeping motion. However, in saying that, don't forget Shift to add, Alt to subtract. So I can press Alt, a little negative sign appears on my lasso, and I can subtract from that shape by creating other shapes. If I wish to add, I can press Shift and a little plus sign appears, and I can add those. These options are up here as well. While we're looking at the options up here, check anti-alias. Anti-alias is basically Photoshop's way of trying to make what is essentially a bunch of squares seem curved. And we can actually see anti-alias at work here, where we get these half tones between the layers. If we don't have anti-alias on, what we're going to end up is with very hard-edged, almost like 8-bit computer game graphics, where it's going to be square to square, and it's going to look kind of low res for us. So anti-alias I recommend for what we're doing with photo manipulation. Keep that ticked on. It usually is the default anyway. So freeform lasso tool, if you want to get this accurately, you better have a damn steady hand and a really good mouse and all the rest of it. But it's going to take way too long, and there's going to be so many corrections. So most of the time I'm going to say don't worry about that. The only time I really do recommend this tool is if you want a quick selection of things and you're not worried about accuracy. So if I want that, I can just quickly zip it around and that will do, and I'll worry about cleaning that up later. So I'm going to deselect that. The next one, I'm going to jump down to the bottom one here, magnetic lasso tool. While I'm on jumping between these tool options, please notice the shortcuts here. It is worth learning the shortcuts for these. Remember, M for marquee tool, L for lasso tool. If you press shift in these shortcuts, it will cycle through these different tools. So I can cycle between freeform lasso tool, shift L, poly, and magnetic. So I'm on magnetic at the moment, and you'll notice there's some options up here, including frequency, contrast, and width. And what we do with the magnetic is we click on an area and we start guiding it closely around as we can, and it will start making its points automatically. And this can be really useful if you've got a good contrast. So this image itself has got a relatively good contrast. The issue starts coming into play when that contrast gets a little bit wavy and Photoshop isn't getting too sure what you want, and it will start getting a little bit lost. Now you can force it to create a anchor point. You can sort of say, okay, we'll go over here, click, and it will stick to that. But for my money, it does get a little bit iffy if the object does not have that really strong contrast. And even if I look up here at other areas, I can see it's not really going where I want it to go. And you can step backwards from this. You'll need to hit delete or backspace, and you will also need to walk your mouse back with it. So if I just sit here pressing delete, it will typically stop after a while, which it seems to be going fairly well on this. So walk it back until you get nothing, or close off your shape by double clicking and then deselecting if you want. So I usually find the problem with using the magnetic lasso tools, I end up going backwards and forwards, and then having to repair it a lot of the time. So most of the time I'd say, for photo stuff, it's usually not that great, but give it a go. You might find a right image for it, and if you want to play around contrast and frequency, be my guest, but that also takes time. The tool I really recommend for this is the poly lasso tool. It only allows you to draw straight lines, click point to point, but it is precise. It goes exactly where you tell it to. Don't forget, if you hit backspace, you will step back to previous points. And so if you do make a mistake, be careful. If you do double click, it will close off the shape, and there you'll have your marching ants. Once again, Alt will allow you to subtract by creating another shape, and Shift will allow you to add, and you can switch between all of our selection tools if you want to do that. Now the reason why I do like this one, it can sometimes take a little bit more time, but zoom in nice and closely. Don't forget Control plus, Control minus is a nice shortcut for that. And spacebar will bring up the move tool. It's down here on the toolbar, but I don't think anyone really uses that. It clicks over here and grabs it. Just the spacebar will allow you to move around when you're zoomed. And then you just zoom in really close and you start clicking away around your object. And once you get the hang of it, it's actually pretty quick. Be wary of the elusive double click. If you accidentally double click, it will close the shape. So let's say I was doing this whole object, which is quite complex. What I would probably suggest is do this in sections. So I'm going to do this bit here. I'm going to double click, great, and then I'm going to shift and then do the next one. So if I really mess that up, do something funky, I could just go Control or Command Z and step back and then just redo that section. Now even though this is just a straight line, I'm going to fudge it up a little bit here anyway. If you do enough points and you step back from that, no one's really going to notice unless they're being absolutely finicky. So zoom in, and we've got absolute control over this, pretty much, except for getting perfect curves. But that's really kind of cool. I'm going to deselect that once again, and let's jump into the next tool.